Hello and welcome to this episode of the Madras Complexity Collective. Today we discuss the wonderful and magical idea that is emergence. Emergence is fascinating, one that has many definitions, but is possibly best explained using the famous quote that is attributed to Aristotle. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The rather a deep philosophical idea, but one that physicists such as our guest today believe to be the key to understanding the mysteries of the universe, the brain, of society, of financial markets, and more. We discuss emergence with one of the leaders in the field, Professor Henrik Jensen of Imperial College London. Henrik has studied emergence not just in the context of statistical physics, where it finds its origin, but also in studying aspects of evolutionary ecology, of markets, in musical compositions, most recently in the brain and consciousness, and more. We hope you enjoy listening to this. For more on this and other interesting conversations, do check out madcomplexity.in.
So thanks, Henrik, for thanks for making the time today. Really appreciate it. So as I told you, what we thought we would do was, spend some time talking about, complex systems, and
Mhm.
really try and dig into this notion of emergence. It's sort of a central idea in complexity, um, and I think it would be really nice to talk about what that means, where it comes from, and why that is such a critical aspect of complexity, right? So maybe just to get started and, uh, you know, what is a complex system, right? I mean, we
Mm.
work with it. Are there simple systems? Are there other kinds of systems? What is a complex system?
Yeah, okay, let me start on this. So actually, my attitude is that it's not worth trying to define a complex system. People have tried that. There are books that tries to with that title, what is a complex system? And that's I don't think it's very fruitful. It's very difficult. It's a little bit well, I compared with say asking what is a biological system or what is a physical system. And the point is that there isn't really a biological system or physical system. There are systems. And then, depending on which aspects you're interested in, you focus on the biological aspects or the physical aspects and so on. Just take an organism, obviously, when if a mouse jumps out from a tree, it follows Newton's law while it is falling down and is a physical system then, but when it eats a cheese, then of course it's a biological system with metabolism and so on. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Specific systems, it's specific aspects of systems. And for me, it's precisely emergence. That's the key feature that complexity science focus on. And that immediately means that it's kind of a meta science in the sense that it can look at any system with many interaction components. That's the essential point, the interaction between the components that leads to systemic collective behavior that is different from the behavior of the individual components. This
Right.
causes sometimes a bit of confusion. I think it's worth also dwell on that a little bit because there are people who would um, say that an ideal gas, a system of non-interaction particles, simply because there are many of the particles. Of course, Avogadro's number, 10 to the 24 or something, in a little macroscopic volume of gas, that's a complex system. But I think that's not a very useful way of thinking of it because the ideal gas equation precisely comes about as just a sum of the effect of the individual non-interacting particles. So the ideal gas equation says that the pressure times the volume is equal to the number of particles times the temperature, and then a constant. And is this equal to the number of particles? That shows that it's just linear in the number of particles. And the way you compute it in any graduate or undergraduate course in statistical mechanics is simply to think of the pressure as the force transferred to the walls of your container by each of the particles, and then sum it up. It's of course obvious that if you only have one particle in your container, it'll just bump into the walls every now and then, and that means that the force exerted on the walls will fluctuate a lot, hence the pressure will fluctuate a lot. But that's all, it'll just fluctuate. And when you have many, then the relative fluctuations will be minute. So that's the difference. But the pressure itself is still not something a single particle couldn't produce. And this is very different from what I think is more proper to call emergent properties. So if we stay within physics, when you go from a gas and cool down, then of course at some point it becomes a liquid. And the liquid has properties that are completely different from the properties of the individual particles, like viscosity. The fact that liquid can creep up along the walls of the containers have to do with viscosity. And of course, the wetness, that we all know what it is, sort of qualitatively, of course, is a physical property coming from the molecules sticking together.
So, Henrik, just on that, because you raised a number of things, and let's stick with the examples that you gave, the ideal gas and the liquid, because what you're saying is that in an ideal gas, you're saying that the pressure is essentially proportional to the number of molecules
Yes.
in the system, right? And when there's a large number of particles, then the pressure essentially remains constant over time, and it is really an additive function of the molecules, right?
Yes.
Now, and then you made the point about in a liquid where the viscosity or other properties of the aggregate are not really in some sense linear combinations of the underlying molecules. So let's try to drill down on this notion of what constitutes emergence then. Is the problem there linearity? Is the problem that once you have a large number of particles, then you have tools of mathematics like the central limit theorem that allow you to then make sense of the aggregate in terms of the components. So the molecules.
It's more than that.
Yeah,
it's more than that, because and this is where the confusion comes from. So the central limit theorem, of course, says that when you add random numbers together, they, if you normalize appropriately, meaning you divide by the square root of the numbers of terms in the sum, you get a normal distribution always, no matter what these numbers describe. And so it is. That's why the pressure is actually a normal. It's the force per area on the walls, and therefore it's an intensive quantity. It doesn't. It's been normalized, and the reason you get something that becomes better and better defined, fluctuates less and less the more molecules you have, is precisely the central limit theorem. So, and that's why some people will say, oh, there you have pressure is an emergent property. I just said that that's not very helpful, because what would we then call things that are had systemic properties that are completely different from the properties of the components? So and this of course goes back to the always quoted Aristotle saying that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And that's a nice catchphrase, because it means precisely that pressure is not an emergent property, because that is just the sum of the parts. It's just that there are many parts. But so this difference is essential. It's properties that you simply cannot define amongst the parts, and viscosity is one of them. It makes no sense to say that a single water molecule has viscosity. I think, and that's of course maybe a little bit a physical technical term, but I guess anybody can imagine that the stickiness, the fact that you feel red on your fingers, you wouldn't if it was just bombarded by air, which is a gas.
So, Henrik, just to sort of So, on the one hand, we have the ideal gas where, we're saying that pressure is not really an emergent property because, to repeat the Aristotelian phrase, that, it is exactly the sum of the parts.
Yes.
But just to sort of maybe take a different example to talk
Mhm.
about emergence, moving
Yes.
away from physics, could you
Yes.
talk a little bit about, and this is work, of course, that we have done together also, about the Schelling model, which is really a model that talks about how, let's say, two different classes or races or types of individuals organize themselves on a lattice or in a city, and
Yes.
how it's very difficult to say from the likes and dislikes of the individuals what is the overall configuration of the way in which they live in the city. So if you could talk about a little bit about the model and why you would consider that an emergent phenomenon.
Yeah. That's a brilliant example of why there is a complexity science, I would say, why there is something to study. Because as you just said, the Schelling model was invented by, of course, Schelling, who was an American polymath, I think, social scientist and mathematician, and this and that. And he back in the around 1970, late 60s, early 70s, he was speculating about the segregation of black and white in American cities. And I don't know how much of this is the historical truth, but the anecdote is that he noticed that people, by and large, were not personally very racist. They would be happy, willing to live in a neighborhood as long as their type wasn't a dramatic minority. If there's 20, 30 something percent, then they wouldn't need to move anywhere else. They would be happy with that. But nevertheless, what you observe is, of course, that the American cities has this tendency to break up into purely white, purely black areas. So why would that happen? If you were to judge from the just by extrapolation of surveys of people, you would say that you would expect to have a homogeneous mix with some fluctuations, some regions where there would be a majority, not a total majority, but a majority of one type, and others where it would be opposite side. But you would have sort of homogeneous mixture across the city, in contrast to what you observed. And then he came up with this simple agent-based model which he ran on a tiny computer because it was a long time ago, consisting of these agents. All what they could do was to stay or move. And he ran it on a square lattice, actually in 1D, but that's inessential. But on a square lattice where you have neighborhood. So you could ask about one agent, say, of type A could look around its neighborhood and see how many of its own kind was in the neighborhood. And if that fraction was too little, then it would want to move. So that's generic, simplistic summary of what he found from surveys that people would say. And then what he found that was different from what maybe one would expect just by extrapolation from the individual was that despite of being willing to live in a neighborhood that had 20%, well, only 20%, the model as a whole would split into completely segregated regions in A and B. And this was the surprise. So that's really an emergent property, right? In the sense that that's the systemic behavior that's completely different from what you would have extrapolated from the behavior of the individuals. And it illustrates, I think, very well the purpose and need of complexity science. Well, the need simply because you can't rely on just simple-minded extrapolation from what you expect from the individuals. And the purpose being that since this model is so simple, it's actually likely to be relevant to many other systems than just specific American segregation. And it's actually used in many social situations, economic situations, that obviously you have done yourself, and also in physics and chemistry and so on, where it's suddenly particles that doesn't have any liking or disliking, but just have some potential for how they interact with their surroundings.
Right.
So in that sense, complexity science summarizes what comes out of I like to think of it as complexity science sort of focus on the in-between, what happens in between the components, whereas, say, atomic physics or psychology focus on the individual person, and sociology focus on the interactions between the individual persons, and therefore social science is generically, in that sense, a complexity science.
Could happen. In fact, I think in this context, Schelling might have been completely wrong, simply because I think a lot of that segregation was driven by structural practices of banks not lending and redlining and all of that.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So actually, but I think you're absolutely right that the mode or the way in which the outcomes emerge in that is particularly useful across a range of systems. So actually, just are you saying that the individual preferences do not matter at all? Or is it just that in order to understand the system, we don't really need to know the exact details of the individual preferences? We need to we can understand this at a higher level in terms of the emergent patterns. Like, is it still not the case that it's what's happening between the individuals that's driving the outcome, right? It might not be additive, but it's very much, if are we absolutely, for instance, saying that if we knew everything there is to know about the individuals, there is absolutely no way we could get to the outcome?
Yeah, if we by individual mean some inherent properties that are independent of their surroundings, yes, then it wouldn't.
Then you would.
So that's the big difference. The ideal gas is called ideal, right? Because you neglect interactions between. So so helium is an example of that. It's very, very, very difficult to produce liquid helium because, or hydrogen, even worse, because the interactions are so weak. But so the ideal gas can never liquefy it, simply because you have, so that's of course a mathematical or conceptual model, but you need to include the interactions. And as soon as you include the interactions, then the well-established formalism of statistical mechanics can explain when it happens. Then it happens as when you go from gas to liquid. And this is, so in the Schelling model is an example of a phase transition. That phase transition that consists of a homogeneous mix of two types, which certainly segregates into two distinct regions. If there was no interactions, or rather, if you only include the effect of the other in terms of some on average expected behavior that you judge from looking at the individual, then you would get that as you would not get the phase transition, no matter how this tolerance level, as it's called, namely how big or small a minority an individual will accept to be part of, it wouldn't happen. And this is typical, seen in the mathematical analysis of complex systems, that when you do things on average, you can lose these phase transitions. And this is well known in physics, that study of phase transitions can be, if you do it only at mean field level, meaning on the average level, you might lose the true behavior. And it's not, there is an important lesson from that, namely that the emergence that you see in the mathematical description of the emergence consists in a very dramatic change of the probability distributions that describe the behavior of the system. This is called symmetry breaking, and accidentally that's the underlying concepts for how we imagine that the world has come about, right? So since the Big Bang, how it's gone through various symmetry breakings that has led to more and more structure in the world. So in the very, very beginning, everything was just the same. The different forces that we know now were not possible to distinguish. That's the idea. And then as the energy density lowered, then you had these symmetry breakings. And this is completely similar to what is happening in in a system like the Schelling model. So there, it's not thermal energy or energy density. It's this acceptance level you change, and then what you would have expected perhaps from a mean from an on average consideration is, of course, that when you go down to a level where the individual A type simply don't want to be in a surrounding, at that level, of course, you'll get segregation. That's pretty clear. But what happens is in the real system, because of the interactions and detailed changes to the statistics, is that this happens long before you go to that limit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it happens abruptly in the sense that at a specific sharp value, like is known from physics in phase transitions, you could intuitively think that when you cool a liquid down, it just became more and more sticky, right? Like more viscous, like honey and something like this. But of course, we all know it's not the case, right? You cool water down, and then at 0 centigrade, suddenly it becomes a solid. Expect from mean field. Not always. You can do, on average, considerations that capture this abruptness, but you need to be more clever. You need to incorporate in what is called a self-consistent way the interaction between the many particles, the many-body aspects, as it's called, the many-party or many-component aspects. So that is I think that's the essential point that sometimes, of course, is left out in all considerations, in whether it's policy or politics or economics or whatever it might be. We have this intuitive way of trying to guess what happens in the world by extrapolating from the behavior of the individuals.
Yeah.
And that can be completely misleading. There is actually an interesting discussion in Tolstoy's book War and Peace on this, which I think most people are not aware of. I think he actually wrote the book as an illustration of his philosophy of history. So he didn't believe that Napoleon was a genius and so on, all the different big names, that they were geniuses. He already then thought that they were just, of course, very powerful, very energetic people that had a run of good luck, and then suddenly it didn't work any longer, right? And that this suddenly didn't work had to do with them overlooking that they were operating in a collective social economic environment. Right. So that's very early complexity science by a Russian author.
And I think just to sort of sum up what you were saying, that all these breakings of symmetry that you were referring to, it is a consequence of the interactions of the components and not due to a change in some fundamental character of the components, right? That's
very important. Yes.
Yeah. And another thing, I think this is something you alluded to earlier, in that you had mentioned that if you were to take this kind of a perspective, a complexity perspective, in looking at various social, economic, biological processes, I think one of the things that you had mentioned this in your book as well, which I thought was a nice thing, was that the basic building blocks of this world then are not things, but actually processes, right?
Yes.
And processes nested within processes. So can you talk a little bit about that and why that's such an important way for us to think about complexity?
Yeah, of course, it's related to what we just talked about. If you think that the building blocks are things, as certainly Western science have for a long time successfully, of course, had this viewpoint, then you're limited in what you'll be looking for. So in that view, you will try to figure out and characterize as carefully as possible the structure of the components. Well, you'll try to figure out what the components are first and foremost, and of course that's been very successfully done in physics and chemistry and so on. Let's take an example from biology, where obviously there was a suspicion of genes being play long before it was realized that DNA could be the physical representation of the genes. And I think I don't know much about it, but I know a little bit about how things have evolved. So at one point, it was like it's just a concept to summarize that there was some sort of agent that took care of part of the inheritance from one generation to another. And then, of course, DNA was discovered and characterized and so on. And then it was maybe pretty obvious to jump to considering this as a long string of different genes where each gene would take care of one specific property. I remember when I was a kid, it was popular on Danish radio to hear about now some American scientists that discovered the gene for why people would be criminal, why they would be homosexual, why they would be clever, this and that, good football players, something. There was the gene for everything. Then the Human Genome Project finished in the early 2000s, right? And there were too few genes. There were only 30,000 of them. And that changed completely the view towards realizing that you couldn't see the properties of biological organisms as just some linear function of these individual labels sitting down along the DNA string. So now people always talk about the gene regulatory network, a network emphasizing how the different genes influence each other. So they even, I know, projects amongst philosophers to try to rethink what you should actually mean by a gene. It's not any longer just a few amino acids. It's how these are arranged together in given circumstances that matters. And this I think illustrates that it's the process. The processes are the essential thing to. Maybe I shouldn't say the essential, but it's essential to look at the processes. Of course, you also need to have the components. It's just that the components play less of an important role than you might have thought. In the 80s and 90s, last century, there was this idea of the theory of everything amongst physicists. They kept talking about the theory of everything. And that it's completely irrelevant for everyone else, but it illustrates the worldview, namely that if you could somehow get to the bottom of all these particles, right? You have the molecules, the nuclei, the quarks, and so on. Then you would have understood everything. That's hence it would be the theory of everything. And people were joking, of course, saying that all you needed was to derive the stock market from the gluons, right? And obviously, that's not how it works. This was realized by some people already then. So there's this very famous and very readable paper by Phil Anderson in Science from 1972 that's definitely worth have a look at. That's called More is Different. And the argument there is simply that it's not true that the most fundamental understanding is at the bottom of the hierarchy of splitting things into smaller parts. Is equally fundamental to understand the new things that appear when you put the components back together, precisely because the whole is not just like a linear sum of the parts. So new properties, new concepts are needed, and so on, in order to handle the collective. And that's the. So what else could it be? It's sort of in the language already. If we talk about the components as the particles and the particles could be humans in sociology, and it could be molecules in cell biology and so on. But the components, the component you decide are the components you want to build on. And then if you realize that the components themselves cannot contain all the phenomena you see at collective level, then it must be the processes in between the components that actually are responsible for these macro phenomena.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this, of course, is a very, again, we've spoken about a number of different kinds of processes, from physics to biology to economics. And each of these, I think, is a very active field of research in identifying, what are these components, how do they interact? And given, especially in social and economic processes, the range of outcomes that you see are so vast, how do you make sense of that given the interactions? I think still remains a very open question in most of these these areas.
Yes.
So Henrik, actually, I was just thinking about, we've spoken about a few of these things, when you think about what are like commonly or ubiquitously occurring emergent phenomena, you spoke about, symmetry breaking. We spoke about the emergence of structure, like in the shelling model. I also wanted to, speak about other kinds of things that happen, and maybe you can talk us through, how to think about emergence, in those contexts. So one I thought for interest is interesting, one I thought was interesting is this whole thing of, how coherence emerges in time. So, whether it's, the flight of starlings, or whether it's the fireflies
Yes.
in Thailand that sort of, mimic the
Uh-huh.
timing of nearby flies. Or a really nice example is the very different kind of example from fireflies is what happened when the London Millennium Bridge opened, which was again an example of, synchronization. So if you could
Yes.
pick up, any of those examples, speak about, what it means for something to emerge out of, the components in that system.
Yeah, the Millennium Bridge is a very interesting illustration because the Millennium Bridge was engineered by one of the world's leading structural engineers, Arup consultants in London. And I mean, they engineering art. So they probably thought, well, a little bridge over the Thames, this we can do left hand, right? And of course, they had thought about the pedestrians walking and the forces they exerted, but they precisely neglected the interaction between the pedestrians. And it took them quite a while before they realized that this was the problem. So what they did was to say, oh, when a bunch of pedestrians walks over a bridge, they'll just walk independent of each other and act with random forces on the bridge. And these random forces will then more or less cancel each other because there'll be some in one direction, some in the other, and they will add up to more or less zero. And this turned out to be completely wrong because what happens is that as soon as the bridge starts to move, the pedestrians notice the motion and counteract it. And of course, they feel the same motion because the bridge is one long elastic line of steel. So therefore, they immediately synchronized, as you talked about, and then they all exert the same force in the same direction, and it adds up completely differently. So that is a very good example of the cost, you could say, of neglecting interactions between your components. And of course, they had to close the bridge for a year, and it took them forever. Well, it didn't. It took many months before they realized that it was this, in a sense, trivial problem, which they just neglected from the very beginning. And of course, in specific situations, there'll be specific reasons. But if we stick to synchronization in some general sense, namely that different components start to somehow sense each other and therefore communicate in a way that they synchronize, either strictly synchronized, so they all do the same at the same time, or maybe out of phase, so syncopated, whatever it might be. There are mathematical descriptions that address this again as a transition among the components. And of course, as we've been talking about all the time, it's driven by the interactions. So there is a very famous mathematical framework called the Kuromoto model, where one looks at the individual oscillators as having their own preferred rhythm of oscillation. And that could differ. So you have different oscillators have different preferred frequencies. So then the question is, as you start to couple them together, will they continue to vibrate or oscillate at their own frequency, or is there an interaction strength where they suddenly lock together and move to synchronize and move together? And there is, and this is in that specific model, that's like any other phase transition, something that happens abruptly, and abruptly in the sense that the onset of synchronization, not that they all synchronize immediately, but the onset happens abruptly, and then as you increase the interaction, more and more will move together.
Right.
And this kind of model has been, it's a very It's a very general framework, and it's certainly been used on fireflies, and it's been used on synchronization in the brain, as you, for instance, see it in epileptic seizure.
Right. And I think in general, one of the things that you notice in a lot of complex systems is, this positive feedback that happens over time that, amplifies certain kinds of outcomes. So, in the work that we have done on modeling, say, inequality and processes like that, it's very much, what we call a preferential attachment model, where, the
Yes.
rich get richer, and that sort of produces a very skewed outcome over time, and that reversing that actually is sort of a difficult process and requires intervention into the system. Just on that, actually, because these ideas of things like preferential attachment and all that, they're very closely related to network and graph theory, and networks are, of course, a very most commonly used tool to analyze or to model, many complex systems,
Absolutely.
on networks. So, if you can, we've spoken about a number of processes, whether it's the Schelling model or whether it's this richer dynamic. What are, and given that these are very nicely characterized as networks, can you talk a little bit at a somewhat high level of, what are some of the key statistical properties of such systems, when you sort of think of them as networks? What should we look out for when we are expecting to see complex behavior?
Yeah. One way of characterizing a network is to talk about how many neighbors, how many links there are to neighboring nodes from one node. And this can, of course, differ. In a lattice, you say a square lattice, everyone has 4 neighbors, but that's a very special case. In general, the networks will be heterogeneous, and some nodes will have many neighbors and some will have few, and you can talk about the distribution of neighbors. That's called the degree distribution. And at least some of the some properties are quite well characterized or depend strongly on the degree distribution. So it's been realized that many networks you observe, and that's been examples of the brain, neurons connected in the brain, airport networks, so on. They have a distribution where there are relatively many nodes with high degree, many neighbors. And these are called power law networks simply because the probability distribution, the probability to find a node with a certain number of neighbors, that is a power law in the number of neighbors, decaying power law. And these networks are like, for instance, their stability is different from a network where you connect, say, with a fixed probability, any pair of nodes, you either connect or don't connect. That's called a binomial network because it's a binomial process. You either do something or you don't do something. In the power law networks, that's also called scale-free networks because the power law is said to be scale-free. Their stability, if you now think of it as a functional network where somehow the interactions or the links between the nodes correspond to some kind of functionality, they have different stability in terms of if a node is taken out of the network, is damaged or infected. If you think of it as, because that's also important, many social networks are also power law networks, scale invariant power networks, and you can ask about spreading of epidemics on infections on such networks. And the fact that you have these nodes that are called hubs that have very, very many, maybe a significant fraction of the network connected either in first step or two steps, means that you can have a completely different behavior of what happens when you do something to one node. Either put a bacteria on that node, meaning a person that then spreads to that person's social connections, or in, let's say, a World Wide Web computer network, if you kill or take one server out of function, and you see the difference. To estimate the effect will depend entirely on what kind of node you have hit. In a binomial network, there is a certain average number of, it's much more homogeneous. There is a certain number of connections on average between a node and its neighbors. And therefore, the more or less independent of which node you manage to perturb or take out of the network or infect, whatever it is you do something to it, will be the same. But in these very heterogeneous scale-free networks, it will make an enormous difference whether you manage to or accidentally hit one of the well-connected or one of the others that are not well-connected. So therefore, the estimate of stability of the network is very different.
Right. So in relation to this, I mean, let me see if I can, formulate this in a coherent way. So when you think about a process like evolution, right, and evolution now is a process that can be applied across, multiple contexts, right? We can think about evolution of life on Earth. We can think about evolution of economies, opinion formation. And so in all of these contexts, you see the emergence and change in structure over time, right? And
Yes.
And when you think of something as complex as the evolution of life, right, with all the richness and the variety that we know has existed through this evolutionary timeline over billions of years, and we can use the framework of complexity to try and get a handle on this. Now, my question is, can this notion of emergence, right, can it really lead us from the simple building blocks or processes, right, to all of this richness and complexity that we see over time? And this is something I think in your book you have a very nice mention of the O'Keefe-Einstein proposition, right? So can we think of emergence leading us from these building blocks, which I don't know, how easy is it to identify them? Can we go from there to what we observe? So just if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So this O'Keefe-Einstein proposition, of course, was my own invention, but inspired by two quotes. They're very well known from Einstein, I guess, with tongue in cheek, that you should never do things more simple than needed. The point is, of course, that you can easily oversimplify and then you lose but you should do it as simple as possible. Anyway, that's Einstein. So he argues for simplicity, and of course he had a certain success in his life by being simple, right? All what he derived and essentially revolutionized all of physics by very, very simple considerations. O'Keefe, American painter, said that there is nothing more unrealistic than realism. If you try to, in your painting, to include all the details, then no, it won't make sense. It'll just be too real, so to say. It'll just be a copy of. There hasn't been any digestion of the impression, and there's no communication, no feelings, no nothing. And I thought this is actually this principle is something we also need especially in complexity science, because we deal with these complicated systems, and in the different fields of science, when we collaborate with, say, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and so on, there is certainly a tradition for trying to include everything. That's also the case sometimes in social modeling. There are people trying to model an entire city with all the different kindergarten, schools, shops, supermarkets, and everything on a computer, right? And of course, you can do it nowadays with supercomputers. But the point is that all what you get, perhaps, is just an equally complicated system as you started out with. So, inspired by Einstein and O'Keefe, you'll feel that, part of the game is precisely to look for simple models and we'll start from the other end. Start with things as simple as possible. And then, of course, be mindful of that you're not going to get everything right. But you're going to get something. And then you can see how far you can go. So we have tried to follow this approach for many years using a framework we call the tangled nature model. And this was inspired back in the early 2000s by statistical physicists becoming aware of punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary, well, in paleontology, actually. It came from Stephen Gould and John Eldridge, who have noticed that the fossil record is not a smooth record of creation and annihilation of species, but it actually comes in bursts. Hence, this punctuation that at certain points in time, there is additional activity in terms of creation and annihilation, extinction, and then there are periods where not much happens. So intermittent dynamics. And my impression was that they actually found that this was somehow alternative to Darwin's smooth change. And we thought this would be interesting to have a look at from a very simple-minded model of evolution. So we constructed this model that consists of individuals that can reproduce, and when they reproduce, they may mutate, and they can be killed. And that's all what there is. And then the only other aspect, but that's very important, is that we assumed all the individuals at the individual level, if you just look at them in isolation, are identical. The way they differ is how they interact with each other. So then we put this in mathematically as just random interactions, and then we saw what comes out of running these stochastic processes consisting of reproduction, mutation, and killing. And what we found was that, of course, at the level of the individuals is always the same thing that happens. Because the way the simulation is set up is that you choose an individual at random, and then you try to see with a certain probability determined by its network of interactions whether it can reproduce, and with a certain probability you make a mutation when it reproduces, and with another probability you kill somebody. So that's what you would say, that's just smooth Markov processes running in parallel. So there is no punctuation there. It's like Darwin probably would have expected. Just a little bit of change once in a while because a mutation occurs. But when you look at the macroscopic level, look at the population level and ask how many are there of the individual types, then you suddenly see that this is very intermittent. You have long stretches where you see coexistence between certain types, and then suddenly this becomes unstable, and you have these punctuations that Gould and Eldridge saw in the fossil record, and there'll be a period of lots of annihilation and creation, and then a new metastable configuration for a while. So you can say that, well, that's an example of a very simplistic model that gave you something, namely punctuated equilibrium. And then obviously you can be disappointed because it didn't predict that elephants or giraffes would develop, right? Because it's too simplistic in that sense. So then you can ask yourself, at that very abstract, simplistic level, what kind of questions can you actually address? And it occurred to us that this is macroevolution. That's say meant to be over millions and billions of years. But of course, ecology is about composition of an ecosystem here and now. What is the distribution of species occupancy? How many species have a certain fraction of the total population? That's called the species abundance distribution. There is another very famous characterization of ecosystems called the species area law. That has to do with you count the number of species inside a number of distinct different species inside a certain area, and then you increase the area, and you see how the number of different species grow in the area. And that's found in observations to depend as a power law on the area. The power law will depend on what species, not too surprising. If you look at birds, for instance, that can move a lot around, it's different from looking at plants, for instance. But in both cases, with a certain approximation, it looks like power laws. So these kind of questions we could then ask ourselves if our abstract types or species fulfilled similar species abundance and species area laws. And yes, they do. So what do you learn from this? Well, if you're an optimistic complexity scientist, you'll say, aha, because the reason that it could be the same in this fantastically simplistic computer model we have, and in reality, is that structures like that are actually determined by some very general features of the interactions between the types, and precisely not by the properties of the individual types alone. Yeah, and of course, precisely because it's such a schematic approach, it's tempting to try to use it on different systems. And people in Denmark, Paolo Shibani, used it for cultural evolution, and it's been used in economics and so on. And that's one of the ways of testing the idea that complex systems might share properties, even if their components are very different.
Yeah.
But if they share similar interaction structure.
Which again goes back to the point about processes being most fundamental rather than, the nature of physical reality.
Yes.
So actually, just related to this, I had one other question. And this is, I guess, a fairly controversial topic in biology, which is the notion of fitness, right? And it's often something that is thought of either at the individual level or at the species level. But given that the way that, you approached, let's say, the tangled nature model, is that very much at the heart of it is interaction. And that is the interaction that produces smoothness and change at the level of the individual, but intermittence at the level of the system, right?
Mm-hmm.
How would you then characterize fitness in such a framework?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. So let me start saying that the motivation for myself personally for suggesting the model when we did it these many years ago was that ever since high school, I felt pretty disgusted by this idea of fitness. Everyone knows how it was misused by in social history by Victorians and Nazis and so on, that you had more or less fit human races and so on. And of course, you don't need to think a lot before you realize that it's completely silly, stupid notion that fitness cannot be like an internal property, like your weight or your height or your whatever it might be, hair color or something. It has always to do with where you are, who you're interacting with. So this was the motivation for how we constructed this tangled nature, and why we call it tangled nature, that namely focusing on how types are entangled with each other. So in the model, as I said, the simplest version of the model, all the individuals are identical if you neglect interaction. And they get their individuality or the difference between the different types through how they interact with different other types. So it doesn't really make much sense to talk about fitness. Of course, if you insist, you can go back and use what is, I think it's called the biological fitness concept. And that is simply your reproduction rate. And that then the different types will have different reproduction rates. But the interesting thing is that reproduction rate, not too surprising, will of course depend on circumstances. It's not something that's given once and for all. It'll depend on who else is around. And I always give this example that a monkey, of course, is much more fit and thriving if there are many bananas and few lions. Whereas if the situation is opposite, then it's not very fit, right? If there are many lions and few bananas. Just showing that fitness seen as a property of the individual is simply wrong.
I think that's really interesting. And I think the way that, the model is structured sort of directly leads to that sort of an interpretation of fitness, rather than starting with the assumption that it's an inherent property and that, such as like you mentioned. So, I guess for me, I had like one other sort of question for you, which is that um, now you've sort of been, working in this area for many, many years now,
Mhm.
right? Um, in terms of, important or interesting, let's say, let's not say interesting, let's say important contributions to understanding that complexity is enabled, whether it be in biology or any of the areas that you have worked in. What would you say are areas that it's really illuminated or helped transform our understanding of how to think about the system? Now, of course, complexity in some sense is a way of looking at the world, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if you start with this understanding that interactions are what matters, then the way you look at things is fundamentally very different. So,
Yeah.
it offers you a new way of looking at the world. But in terms of just problems that have existed for a long time, open questions in science, what are some key areas in which understanding of complexity and emergence has been important to progress?
Let's start with one that I think is clear. Everyone will agree on there has been an impact from these ideas in a general sense, just perspective-wise, neuroscience. So the of course, yeah, in sort of the attempt to understand the dynamics of the neurons, and then with the hope, of course, that that lead to understanding of cognition and intelligence or whatever it might be. And that's this idea of the brain being in a critical state. And I need to explain what is meant by this. It's jargon borrowed from statistical mechanics. So we talked about phase transitions before, and what is called second order phase transitions, but it's not so important. There is a certain type of phase transitions where precisely when the phase transition happened. So one example is in magnetic systems. If you buy a compass and you have a little magnetic needle and you were stupid enough to heat it up, then you would lose your magnetic moment at a certain temperature. And when that happened, the state is your system is in a critical state. And let me explain what is meant by critical state here. The criticality is just a name for the interdependence in the system being long range. So so there are interactions, and they can be short range, just from neighbor to neighbor. But then suddenly at this critical state, then what happens in one position at one time can be related and relate to what happens far away to another time, later in time. And mathematically, it's said that the correlation functions decay algebraically in space and time. So this has been known to be the case in certain statistical mechanics systems under certain circumstances, and this was a big thing back in the 1970s. The realization that something peculiar went on at phase transition points have been known since early 1900. But the theory for this was really first developed fully in the 70s. And then in the late 1900s, just before 2000, self-organized criticality came around. That's a suggestion that this critical state is much more relevant to systems than you would expect by what I just said, that you need to tune to a certain temperature and it will just be precisely at the phase transition point and so on. That generically in many component systems, the dynamics would take the system without much tuning into this kind of critical state. And then people started to look for indicators of that. And that has been influential. Now we're talking about where it has been influential. It occurs to me that beyond neuroscience, it's certainly also been influential in astrophysics and in geophysics, earthquake structure, and so on. But let's stick to neuroscience. It was then very early on suggested that the firing of the neurons, if you just look at that aspect, we're not talking about cognition or anything, that the very firing of the neurons would be in this sort of critical state with long range interdependence. And this was then verified by various observations. Early 2000, 2003, by a very famous paper by Bex and Plentz, where they saw on rat tissue that the actual firing of the neurons had this kind of long-range avalanche structure. So when one fire, it can trigger others to fire. That's how you interpret the experiment. And how big an avalanche of firings you get is a power law distribution. And that's, of course, at microscopic level in the sense that that's down at the individual neurons. You follow some few thousands of neurons and see what happens. And then later on, it was realized that even at fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, which looks at volumes in the brain with a few millimeters in each direction, so containing many, many, many thousands and thousands of neurons. And then you try to see how the activity within these small boxes, as they're called, how they are interdependent. That exhibit the same kind of long-range interdependence. So these are the indicators that the brain is in a critical state. And this is a very active research area, because the question is, of course, why is it in a critical state? How does that relate to cognitive processes, thought, whatever, mind in general? And that's not known. What is known is that the robustness of this critical state is immense. It seems like if a brain is alive, it's in a critical state. And there are some indication that you can drive it out of it by stimuli, for instance, that it then can go into a state that's characterized by specific periodicities in the activity and so on. But let's get back to, so this is I think a prime example of where this thinking in terms of phenomenology discovered in complex systems science has been very useful. But another field where I think something similar has happened is in economics. So economics some years back was typically an exercise in equilibrium systems. The first thing people would say is that we assume equilibrium. By that they meant stationarity, that the probability distributions and what you observed would not evolve in time. It'll fluctuate, but it'll be the same kind of statistics all the time. And obviously, I don't know why that was so persistent, because it's clearly the rest of us that are not economists would have noticed that you have these crashes every so often, right? And that economics is definitely not an example of a stationary system. And this, I think, is now by and large accepted amongst economists. And management science, for instance, have also picked up on it, that there are these emergent structures and interactions are very important. And let's mention biology also. So most recently, we tried to use the tangled nature framework to address global warming. So we combined that model with metabolic theory, or metabolic ecological theory. And metabolic ecological theory is an attempt to make the bookkeeping of how energy is flowing around in the ecosystem. And since energy, of course, flow through metabolism, i.e. chemical processes, then you can use chemical statistics, physics on estimating rates of processes and so on. And we combined that, and obviously, as often, we didn't get the money we needed in order to really develop the project, but we did manage to show that by very simplistic combination of tangled nature and with metabolic ecological theory, you can actually predict what happens to an ecosystem if you increase the temperature. And I guess the only proof we have that it makes sense was that when we told it to one of our biological colleagues, she said immediately, "Oh, but I knew that beforehand." Which, of course, would prove that it probably was successful.
I was just thinking about when you were saying that, it's obvious to anyone who looks at economics that, it's a system in disequilibrium. And the example of the financial markets that you gave, it's kind of, maybe not that dissimilar from the punctuated equilibrium that you mentioned earlier in the evolutionary timeline. Maybe there are sort of parallels there. And again, this notion that these systems have a lot of equivalences, even though they describe very, very different sorts of things. So Henrik, I know I said it was the last question, but when you were speaking, one other thing came to my mind is your work on music, and because you spoke about the brain. Again, you were looking at how we respond to musical stimuli, and I think you've done some work on I think the unexpectedness of a performance, right? I think you,
Yeah.
so if you can just, speak a little bit of that and what you have found there.
Yeah, okay. So it's very modest what we have done, but so I need to explain the background for this. So we worked together with brilliant musicians at one of the conservatoires in London called Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and there is this very unusual pianist, concert pianist called David Dolan, and he's one of a few Western musicians that wants to bring improvisation back into classical music. So, I mean, for an Indian or Persian or Arabic musician, they wouldn't even know what we're talking about, right? Because you're always starting from improvisation. But obviously, in classical music in the West, there's been this division of labor, so to say, that the composer write the score, the musician play the music. And although back in the 1600, 1700, it was assumed by the composer that the musician would actually improvise on top of the composition in order to make it fit in with the special occasion. This died out, according to David Dolan, around World War I. It became assumed amongst theoreticians that there was the ultimate performance of a piece. And therefore, you shouldn't improvise, right? You should try to strive towards this ultimate performance. And that's a real killer. That makes, of course, music dead, obviously. So, funny enough, it's difficult to understand as a layperson. This is a very heated debate in Western conservatoires. Well, and David Dolan only came to UK because the virtuoso violinist Jero Minuin persuaded him to give up his position at the Paris Conservatoire and come and work at Guildhall. And the reason being that in France, they would, he says, David Dolan says, consider this improvisation as a bad excuse for not rehearsing. So then you just do something, right? That's and I would say that's coming from Denmark, that would be the same attitude that you improvise when you haven't really prepared. That's, of course, not the idea. The idea is, as you as an Indian musician will know, of course, that you need even more to be into the music in order to be able to interpret as you go along. Anyway, this was the background for the project. And then David Dolan wanted to have some hard science to support the idea that improvisation is important. And whether that was needed or not, I don't really know. He says it's been very useful for him in his discussions with his colleagues in the teaching of classical music. But anyway, what we did was to do the ideal experiment, you can say, because since these are classically trained musicians, they're very good at playing exactly the score in some sort of technical, precise, what they call a strict manner, which they would use if they were participating in a music competition, for instance, which in the West at the moment apparently focus mainly on technique. Simply, music, technique in the sense of putting your fingers the right places at the right moment. And then having followed David Dolan's teaching, they are also able to improvise on top of the score. And this we call let go, where they, well, as the word says, they let the emotional part play an important contribution to how they perform the music. And then we've had EEG recordings of the musicians and some of the audience, and we looked at what the difference in the brain response is in these two different modes of performance. And I guess one of the very interesting findings was that the activation level in musicians and audience is essentially identical during the what is called the tinkle factor moments, that where the music is really capturing you of the let go performance. Then the EEG activation becomes essentially the same. So you can say the interpretation would be that in order for the musician to imprint her or his state of mind on the audience, you really need to have this let go improvisatory approach. And since this is what classical, whether it's Eastern or Western or Indian or whatever, art music is about, is of course to communicate your state of mind. So that was an interesting success. How does it relate to complexity science? Well, in the first round, I just thought that you can't think of anything more complex than the playing brain, right? The performing brain. And if you could understand, just mathematically find ways to characterize that system, this would certainly be of interest. But of course, it has also to do with complexity science in the sense that you can actually see the interaction between the audience and the performers. So it has to do with the interaction. In the most recent experiment we did, we worked together with colleagues from Tokyo University, and they came to London for a concert we had at Guildhall, where they brought accelerometers, smartphones that the entire audience had around their necks, so that you could monitor their body motion. And then you could see what happens is that in the strict version, and also in the let go, there's always a synchronization of body motion to the meter. In Western music, you have 4/4 or 2/4 and so on. You have this meter underlying. And in rock music, of course, it's really, really, really mechanical, because the drummer would normally beat it out. In classical music, in chamber or music settings, it's more smooth. But in the strict version, they stick to this metronomically, really very technically. And in the let go, they also have it underlying. So you can always see that the audience sense this, and somehow their body motion lock into that. But then that's about, well, a fraction of a second. Depending on how fast you play the music, obviously, but typically it's a fraction of a second. And then what we discovered was that in the let go mode, there is an additional synchronization frequency. And that has to do with what we call music synchronization. So that's the actual music. That's the structure of the music that the audience pick up, but they don't pick it up nearly as well in the strict mode. I think as a musician, you'll see that immediately, right? Because that's the bit that you as a musician try to communicate. That's the longer structures. That's sort of the sentences, whereas the metronomic, that's like the letters of the individual words or something. So that was quite interesting. You see that how it influences the interaction between the performers and the audience. And of course, synchronization of the audience is also synchronizing a matter about interacting with each other. Yeah.
I mean, fascinating, Henrik. I think it was a really fun conversation. I think we discussed so many different kinds of systems, and hopefully from all of that, there is a sense of emergence that emerges from this conversation. So, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Very nice discussion. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.